Sometimes the most ordinary people hide the most extraordinary stories. In today's episode, you'll step inside a true-to-life drama that feels like a movie but is rooted in real experiences. To respect the privacy of those involved, I've changed their names and locations. This allows us to focus on the heart of the story, not personal details. So lean in, listen closely, and follow along as each twist unfolds. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. Hit that button so you won't miss our next story. Tap like and leave a comment saying I'm listening so we can stay connected and share every moment together. It was a cold Monday morning at exactly 9 a.m. when Linda Walker, a slender 67-year-old woman with silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her head, pushed open the heavy oak doors of courtroom 305 at the Cook County Courthouse in Chicago. The marble floors beneath her sensible shoes echoed with each step. She wore a simple gray wool coat buttoned to the collar and carried a worn leather handbag that had once belonged to her late husband. To anyone watching, she might have seemed like any other elderly woman nervously attending a hearing, but inside her heart pounded like a drum. This was not just another day in court. This was the day she would reclaim her dignity. Across the aisle, her only son, Michael Walker, 35, tall and broad-shouldered in a tailored navy suit, sat stiffly at the defendant's table. Next to him was his wife, Emily, a poised woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a pearl necklace. Emily leaned toward Michael, whispering something with a quick flick of her manicured hand. Both of them glanced at Linda, their expressions a mix of irritation and disdain. The sight made Linda's stomach tighten. She remembered how, just a few years ago, Michael would greet her with a hug every Sunday at church, how Emily used to call her Mom. Now their eyes were cold, like strangers. Linda walked slowly to her seat at the plaintiff's table. The weight of the leather bag heavy against her arm, she set it down gently, as though it contained something fragile. In a way, it did. Papers, photographs, and documents that could change everything. She folded her hands tightly to steady herself. Judge Robert Hill, a tall man in his early 60s with graying hair and reading glasses perched at the edge of his nose, shuffled through the case file in front of him. When he finally looked up and saw her face, his brows shot upward in recognition. "Mrs. Walker, is that really you?" he asked, his voice carrying across the silent room. The quiet buzz of side conversation ceased instantly. Even the bailiff paused mid-stride. Everyone stared at Linda as if a secret had just been revealed. She gave a small nod, her lips pressed together. "Good morning, Your Honor," she replied softly, but there was an unmistakable steel in her tone. Inside, however, her chest was tight. She remembered the nights spent awake in her small apartment, rehearsing this moment, wondering if she would tremble or falter. "Don't show them your fear," she told herself now. Her eyes met Michael's across the room, but he quickly looked away. Judge Hill adjusted his glasses. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "let's begin." Linda straightened her back, smoothing the front of her coat. She reached for her handbag, feeling the reassuring weight of the evidence inside. "Yes," she murmured to herself, almost like a prayer. "Let's begin." That simple sentence hit a storm of emotion. Years of silence, betrayal, and sacrifice. Today she wasn't just a frail old mother in a courtroom. She was a woman ready to fight for the truth. Linda Walker was born in the quiet town of Springfield, Missouri, the youngest of 3 sisters in a family of church musicians. Her earliest memories were of sunlight slanting through stained glass windows and the smell of polished wood in the church hall as she practiced the piano after school. Music was her first love, and teaching it became her calling. After graduating from the University of Missouri, she spent years teaching music at a public middle school, shaping small hands to play scales and teaching shy voices to sing in harmony. In her late 20s, she met Mark Walker, a tall, soft-spoken man who repaired instruments for a living. They fell in love over coffee at a local diner, and after marrying, they moved to Chicago, chasing bigger dreams. Together, they opened a small music shop on Clark Street. Violins lined the walls, guitars hung from hooks, and the smell of sheet music and varnish filled the air. Linda would teach in the mornings at school, then spend her afternoons behind the shop counter, polishing clarinets or showing parents which flute was best for their child. In the evenings, she went home to cook for her son Michael, promising him, You'll get to go to college, sweetheart. We'll make sure of it. Those promises were not empty. For 40 years, she balanced teaching, running the shop, and raising Michael. Mark would joke, "Linda, you're the engine that keeps us all running." And she would laugh, but inside she felt the weight of it all. Still, she kept going, believing that one day her sacrifices would build a bridge of love and security for her son. When Mark died suddenly of a heart attack in 2018, the shop felt emptier than ever. Linda sold it and moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Rogers Park, her walls lined with photographs of Mark and framed recital programs from Michael's childhood. She hoped his death would bring Michael and her closer. "At least now it's just the two of us," she thought on lonely nights, clutching Mark's old cardigan for comfort. But the opposite happened. Michael, now a busy 35-year-old tech entrepreneur in Evanston, became more distant. He stopped dropping by unannounced. Emily, his wife, worked in real estate and always seemed in a rush, her smile tight whenever she visited. At first, Linda tried to ignore the tension. Every Sunday she set her small dining table with her best plates, lit a candle, and simmered Mark's favorite beef stew. "I made your favorite, honey," she would tell Michael with a hopeful smile. But Michael would sit scrolling on his phone, nodding absent-mindedly, while Emily politely complimented the food but checked her watch. Phone calls became shorter, texts curt and delayed. Sometimes days went by without a word. Linda told herself it was just the rhythm of modern life. "He's busy, that's all," she whispered to the empty kitchen as she washed the dishes alone. Yet deep down a quiet fear grew. She had given everything, her time, her youth, her savings, to build Michael's future. And now, as she placed leftovers into small containers for the fridge, she wondered if that bridge of love she'd built had somehow collapsed without her noticing. She didn't know it yet, but a storm was gathering, and the greatest test of her life was still ahead. It was a bitterly cold Thursday evening in February. Outside on Clark Street, the snow was falling in thick, silent sheets, coating parked cars and muffling the sounds of the city. From her small apartment window on the 3rd floor, Linda Walker could see the streetlights glowing like yellow halos against the white night. She tightened her cardigan around her shoulders and checked the oven one more time. The smell of honey-glazed Southern-style roast chicken, Michael's old favorite, filled the kitchen. On the counter, a pot of buttery mashed sweet potatoes steamed gently. She had set the small dining table with a blue and green checkered cloth, just like the one she used when Michael was a boy, and placed a vase of fresh tulips in the center. She smoothed the cloth with trembling hands and took a deep breath. "This will be good," she whispered to herself. "Maybe tonight we'll talk. Just the 3 of us." The doorbell rang at 6:45. Emily came in first, snow clinging to her expensive black boots. She didn't take off her long camel coat. Instead, she pulled out a chair and sat down with her purse still on her arm, scrolling on her phone. Her perfume smelled sharp, like cold lilies. "Evening, Emily," Linda said softly, trying to sound cheerful. "How was work?" Emily glanced up briefly. "Busy. The market's crazy right now." Then she went back to her phone. Michael followed a step behind, brushing snow from his hair. He didn't kiss his mother's cheek as he used to, just stood there surveying the little apartment as if it were a stranger's home. Linda's heart squeezed at the sight. "Dinner's ready," she said. "Honey-glazed chicken, your favorite." Michael nodded but didn't smile. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. Emily put her phone away and looked at him expectantly. "Mum," Michael began, his voice flat, businesslike. "We need to talk." Linda's hands froze on the serving spoon. "All right," she said cautiously. Michael exchanged a glance with Emily before continuing. "This apartment isn't safe for you anymore. You're living alone on the 3rd floor, no elevator, old wiring." Emily jumped in, her tone bright but cutting. "We've been looking into Maple Springs. It's one of the best senior communities in the city. They even have a yoga studio for older adults. You like yoga, right?" Linda stared at them, her mind blank for a moment. "This is my home," she finally managed. Her voice cracked. "Your father and I made every memory of our life here. Birthdays, holidays, the first time you played the piano." Emily leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. "Memories belong in your heart, not in the walls of an old building." Linda turned to her son, hoping to see some hesitation, some trace of the boy who once built her a cardboard Valentine's Day card. But Michael just lowered his eyes and gave a small nod. Something inside Linda cracked like ice underfoot. She forced herself to stand up, wiping her hands on her apron to keep them from shaking. The kitchen smelled of warm chicken and honey, but to her it suddenly seemed like a stranger's house. "Please," she said softly, "eat before it gets cold." But her voice had lost its warmth. She watched as Michael picked at his food without looking at her. Emily was already talking about deposit fees and waiting lists. Linda sat back down, her gaze drifting to the tulips in the vase. Their red petals glowed under the kitchen light, but she could no longer smell them. Inside her chest, her heart felt heavy, splintered. She realized with a dull ache that she had prepared not just a dinner, but a farewell. And her son had brought betrayal to the table instead. The next morning, a sharp knock on the door woke Linda before she'd even finished her first cup of coffee. Outside, snow still clung to the window ledge of her small Rogers Park apartment. She shuffled to the door in her slippers, expecting the mail carrier, and instead found a thin envelope slipped under the crack. The letterhead read Harrison and Cole Attorneys at Law in dark blue script. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the crisp paper. The words blurred for a moment, but the meaning was unmistakable. A formal request for her to sign over the ownership of her apartment. She sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where she had served so many family meals, and dialed her neighbor, Mrs. Carter, on the old landline. "They want me to sign the apartment over to them," Linda whispered, her voice breaking. "They've hired lawyers now." Mrs. Carter gasped on the other end, then spoke gently. "Oh, honey, don't sign anything until you've had someone look at it. This is your home." At 2 p.m., there was another knock at the door, this time heavier, more insistent. When Linda opened it, Michael and Emily were standing there. Michael held a sleek leather briefcase. Emily had a folder of papers tucked under her arm. They didn't even remove their coats before stepping inside. "Mom," Michael began, setting the briefcase on the dining table. "This is for your own good. If you sign these transfer documents, we can get you a private room at Maple Springs right away. You won't have to worry about anything. We'll take care of it all." Linda clasped her hands together, trying to keep them from shaking. "This is my home," she said, her voice quivering but firm. "Your father and I saved for decades to buy it. Every wall here has a story. Every corner is our life." Emily rolled her eyes and let out a soft scoff. "Memories don't pay for repairs, Linda. The plumbing's ancient. The heating's unreliable. You're better off letting go." Linda bit her lip so hard she tasted blood. She could feel tears pressing behind her eyes, but she would not cry in front of them. She straightened her back, speaking slowly. "I'm not signing anything today." Emily snapped the folder shut and stood up abruptly, her heels clicking on the linoleum floor. "Fine," she said sharply, "but next week the appraiser will come. We're moving forward whether you're ready or not." Michael avoided his mother's gaze as he gathered the papers, murmuring, "It's for the best. Mom, you'll see." When they left, the apartment felt colder, as though the snowstorm had crept inside. The roast beef Linda had prepared for lunch sat untouched on the counter. She didn't even bother to cover it. Instead, she walked slowly to the living room, sat down in her old armchair, and picked up a framed photograph of Mark holding a 4-year-old Michael at the beach in Michigan. The boy in the photo was laughing, clutching a toy boat. Linda traced their faces with her fingertip, her eyes filling with tears. "Mark," she whispered into the quiet room. "How did we get here?" Her tears fell silently onto the frame, and for the first time in years she felt truly alone in her own home, the home that now hung by a thread. From that day on, Linda's little apartment on Clark Street stopped feeling like a sanctuary and started feeling like a marketplace. Strangers came and went without warning. Some mornings she would still be in her robe holding her first cup of tea when a hard knock rattled the door. "Mrs. Walker?" "We're here to view the property," a man in a gray overcoat would announce as soon as she opened. Behind him, another person would stride in, holding a clipboard and a tape measure, already peering into corners. They never waited for her invitation. "This plumbing is ancient," one realtor muttered, bending under the sink. "You'll need to gut the kitchen. The flooring is outdated." "Squeaks everywhere," another said, tapping his pen on her hardwood floor. the same floor Mark had painstakingly laid down with his own hands, while Michael was still in high school. Linda could still remember Mark kneeling in his work jeans, measuring and cutting planks, calling out to Michael to hand him nails. Every squeak is a memory, she thought bitterly, as the strangers scribbled notes. Emily began dropping off glossy brochures from Maple Springs every week. One evening she swept in, her heels clicking on the tile, and laid a fresh pamphlet on the table like a trophy. "They've added Zumba classes for seniors now," she said brightly. "Isn't that fun?" Linda gave a faint, tired smile, but didn't look up from the dish she was scrubbing. "I'm not interested in dancing, Emily," she murmured. "Mom, you'll love it," Emily insisted. "They have a juice bar, too." When they left, Linda sat at the kitchen table and folded the brochure carefully, her hands slow and deliberate. She stared at the cheerful photographs of silver-haired couples doing yoga and sipping smoothies. "I don't want to go anywhere," she whispered to herself, pushing the pamphlet into a drawer she never opened. Michael's messages grew shorter and colder. "Don't be stubborn, Mom," he texted one evening. "We're only trying to help you." She stared at the glowing screen for a long time before setting the phone down, face down on the table. Outside her window, she could see the neighborhood she had come to know like a friend over decades. The Italian bakery at the corner, where the owner still saved her a loaf of fresh ciabatta every Saturday. The little newsstand where she bought her morning paper. The park bench where she used to sit with Mark on spring afternoons. Every day now. Another piece of her life was being evaluated, catalogued, or dismissed. She felt as if she were being erased from her own story, one signature, one visit at a time. The scent of her home, lemon polish and old wood, began to feel like a memory already fading. At night, she would sit alone in her living room, a blanket over her knees, staring at the framed photographs on the wall. There was Michael at 8 years old, grinning with a missing front tooth. Mark tuning a guitar in the background. "How did it come to this?" she asked the empty room. Her voice echoed softly, swallowed by the walls that no one seemed to value but her. Friday afternoon was gray and drizzly, the kind of Chicago day when the wind off Lake Michigan cut straight through your coat. Linda had just returned from the corner bakery with a small loaf of ciabatta when the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone. Wiping her hands on a dish towel, she opened the door and found 3 figures standing on her threshold. Michael in his dark winter coat, Emily in a tailored burgundy suit, and a tall man she didn't know carrying a leather briefcase. "Mrs. Walker," the man said smoothly. "I'm Daniel Harrison from Harrison & Cole. We're here to finalize some paperwork." Linda stepped back instinctively, letting them in more out of shock than courtesy. The smell of wet wool and cold air followed them into her warm kitchen. Michael placed his gloves on the table without asking. Emily kept her eyes on the briefcase. "We have the transfer documents ready," Harrison continued, opening the case and laying out a neat stack of papers. "This will move the ownership of the apartment into Michael's name. All you need to do is sign at the bottom." Linda stared at the papers, her stomach twisting. "I thought you two were planning to sell the apartment," she said slowly, glancing at her son. Emily shifted in her seat, eyes darting away. "We decided it's better to keep it. As an investment for the family," she said lightly, but her fingers fidgeted with the clasp of her purse. That was the moment the truth settled over Linda like a heavy blanket. They weren't just trying to move her out. They were trying to take what she and Mark had built. She pressed her palms flat on the table to steady herself. "I'm not signing anything," she said, her voice low but firm. Michael's expression hardened. "Mom, you're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, dropping the gentle tone he'd used earlier. "You're not really in a position to make these decisions anymore." Linda blinked. "Excuse me?" Emily leaned forward, her perfume sharp in the small kitchen. "If you refuse to cooperate, we'll have no choice but to petition the court to declare you legally incompetent. It's for your own protection." The words hit Linda like a slap. She took a small step back, clutching the strap of her handbag. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. This was her son and daughter-in-law, the people she'd cooked for, prayed for, now threatening to strip her of her independence. "I see," she whispered, her knuckles white around the bag. Her eyes darted to the window, to the snowflakes melting on the glass. She felt suddenly like a stranger in her own kitchen, the walls tilting, the floor unsteady. Michael exhaled sharply. "Just sign, Mom," he said, sliding the papers toward her. Linda didn't move. She straightened her back, feeling her spine stiffen the way it used to before walking into a classroom full of students. "No," she said clearly. "I will not sign." For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the kitchen clock Mark had bought years ago. Harrison cleared his throat, began gathering the papers. Emily stood up quickly, her chair scraping the floor. "Fine," Emily snapped. "The appraiser will be here next week." "This isn't over." They left without another word, the door slamming behind them. Linda stood in the quiet kitchen, trembling, her handbag clutched against her chest. Anger and grief churned inside her like a storm, but beneath it, a tiny flicker of resolve began to glow. That night, Linda sat awake in her small living room, the lamp casting a pool of yellow light over the carpet Mark had chosen decades ago. Outside the window, fat snowflakes drifted down, softening the streetlights along Clark Street. She wrapped her old knitted shawl tighter around her shoulders and pressed her forehead against the cold glass. "Am I really that old? That useless?" she wondered, her breath fogging the pain. For a moment, she imagined Mark sitting beside her as he used to, his hand warm on hers. Her thoughts raced. The strangers measuring her kitchen, Michael's voice turning hard, Emily's sharp perfume. She felt humiliation, anger, but also something else, a flicker of defiance she hadn't felt in years. "No," she whispered to the empty room, her voice trembling but steady. "I will not let them take everything. Not like this." She dozed only briefly, still in her chair, until the gray light of morning crept through the blinds. The smell of coffee she'd brewed out of habit filled the kitchen. She was sipping it, staring at the steam, when the buzzer rang. She opened the door and found Emily standing there alone, dressed in a sleek winter coat, no smile on her face. "I came to help you pack, Linda," Emily said flatly, stepping inside before being invited. "It's better to get started now." Linda blinked, her fingers tightening on the mug. "Pack?" she repeated. "Yes, for Maple Springs. It will be easier for everyone," Emily said, already moving toward the living room. Linda followed, her heart pounding. She watched as Emily began taking down framed photographs from the wall. Michael at 5 years old holding his first guitar, Mark standing proudly behind him, and stacking them on the coffee table. Emily's hands were brisk, efficient, like a stranger hired to clear an estate. "Wait," Linda said, her voice rising. "Those are my memories." "They'll be safer in storage," Emily replied without looking up. She opened the cedar chest and pulled out a black dress, the one Linda had worn at Mark's funeral. "We can donate this," she said. "No point keeping things you'll never wear again." Linda felt her knees weaken. "That's my husband's memory," she whispered. But Emily was already folding it into a donation bag. Then Emily reached for a small jewelry box on the sideboard. "And these," she said calmly. "I'll put them in the bank for safekeeping. You'll thank me later." Linda stepped forward, clutching the back of a chair for balance. "Those are mine," she cried, her voice breaking. Tears blurred her vision. "Mark gave me those pieces. They're all I have left." Emily paused only briefly, then placed the box into her tote bag. "It's for your own good," she said coolly. At that moment, something inside Linda snapped. It wasn't just about the jewelry, or the dress, or even the apartment. It was about dignity, about years of sacrifice now being swept into bags and boxes as if they were clutter. She looked at Emily, the young woman who had once called her Mom, who used to bring her flowers on birthdays, and saw only greed and calculation. Her tears dried as quickly as they had come. She stood straighter, shoulders back, feeling a strange calmness. "I've lost my son," she thought, "and I've lost her too, but I haven't lost myself." Emily kept packing, unaware of the shift. But for Linda, the turning point had come. She would no longer be silent, no longer let her life be dismantled piece by piece. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind when the city seems to slow down under a pale winter sun. The apartment felt unusually still, No phone ringing, no footsteps in the hallway. Linda had just washed the last of her coffee mugs and set it carefully in the dish rack when her eyes wandered to the old oak bookshelf Mark had built by hand. It stood against the living room wall, its wood darkened with age, holding decades of sheet music, photo albums, and odds and ends of their life together. She hesitated at first. That bottom drawer had always been Mark's domain, locked, mysterious, left untouched since his death. But something about the day, about the ache in her chest, gave her the courage. Kneeling down, she ran her fingers over the worn brass handle. "Mark," she murmured softly, "if you're still looking out for me, show me what I need to see." She reached into a small tin where Mark used to keep spare screws and found a tiny key taped under the lid. Her hands trembled as she slid it into the lock. It clicked open with a sound that echoed in the quiet apartment. Inside lay a thick folder, neatly bound, its edges slightly frayed. On the cover was Mark's familiar handwriting, "For Linda." Her heart started to hammer. She carried the folder to the kitchen table, sat down slowly and opened it. The scent of paper and Mark's faint cologne drifted up as if he were standing right behind her. The first pages were legal documents, deeds, statements, lists of assets. She blinked, trying to absorb what she was seeing. Mark had sold the music store 5 years before his death, invested the money in stocks and municipal bonds, and quietly purchased another apartment in Evanston. Each sheet detailed accounts and properties she had never known existed. There, in black and white, was a clear statement. Everything belonged to Linda Walker. Michael would inherit only a small trust, and only if he fulfilled his obligation to care for his mother with respect and kindness. Linda's breath caught. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes blurring. She read it again, slower this time, as if to convince herself it wasn't a dream. Among the papers lay a letter, folded in thirds, with her name on the front. Mark's handwriting was unmistakable. "My dearest Linda," it began. "If you're reading this, it means I am no longer there to protect you. I know people can change, even those we love, but you must stay strong. Everything I've built is for you, to keep you safe, to keep you free. Don't let anyone make you doubt your worth." Her hands shook as she held the letter, tears sliding down her cheeks. Tears of gratitude, of sorrow, of sudden empowerment. She pressed the papers to her chest and closed her eyes, feeling his presence as clearly as if he had just spoken. All at once, the years of humiliation and self-doubt began to shift. She was not the weak old woman Michael and Emily imagined. She was the wife Mark had trusted to carry on his legacy. She rose from the table slowly, the folder still clutched to her chest. Outside, the snow had stopped, and sunlight spilled through the blinds, catching the dust in golden motes. For the first time in months, she felt her back straighten naturally, her breath deepen. She whispered to the empty room, "Thank you, Mark. I understand now." The woman who had sat silently while others planned her life was gone. In her place stood someone ready to fight, with proof in her hands and a fire in her heart. The kitchen clock ticked softly as Linda spread the documents across her small oak dining table. The table, scarred with decades of family meals and homework assignments, was now a battlefield of papers and signatures. Outside, dusk had deepened into a velvet night, and the street below glimmered with patches of snow under the orange glow of the streetlights. She took a slow breath, her fingers tracing each line on the pages, as if the ink itself could steady her. There were shares in the tech company where Michael worked, a deed to the Evanston property, and a large savings account she had never seen before. "Mark," she whispered, her voice catching, "you planned everything." The letter he had left sat open in front of her, its creased paper smoothed flat by her palms. She read again the sentence that now felt like a lifeline. "If Michael ever treats you badly, you have the right to protect yourself." She pushed back her chair and walked to the framed photograph of Mark on the living room wall. A candid shot of him laughing at a summer barbecue, sunlight caught in his hair. For months she had looked at that photo with grief. Tonight she saw something else. A quiet strength reflected back at her. "You knew, didn't you?" she said aloud, her voice firmer. "You knew what might happen." She poured herself a small glass of water, sipping it slowly as she stared at the documents. The numbers and legal terms no longer felt like a foreign language. They felt like armor. Each account was a shield, each deed a sword. She could almost hear Mark's voice in the room, calm and steady. "You're stronger than you think. Linda." At one point, she caught her reflection in the darkened window. The silver hair pulled back, the determined set of her jaw. She barely recognized the woman staring back. "I'm not afraid anymore," she murmured. She gathered the papers into neat piles, labeling each with sticky notes from the kitchen drawer. In another pile, she placed the names of lawyers Mark had recommended in his letter. Her movements grew precise, purposeful, like a teacher preparing a lesson plan. Except now, the lesson was survival. Hours passed. The apartment grew quiet except for the rustle of paper and the low hum of the refrigerator. At midnight, she brewed another pot of coffee, a habit from her years of grading student assignments late at night. She mapped out steps on a notepad: call attorney on Monday, secure bank accounts, change locks, review legal options. Each line of ink steadied her heartbeat. By the time a pale winter dawn seeped through the blinds, Linda was still awake, but her exhaustion was mixed with a strange exhilaration. She stood at the window, watching a single bird land on the snowy branch of the tree outside, and felt a rush of energy. The fear that had weighed her down for months had begun to lift. She touched the folder at her side, holding it like a talisman. "This time," she whispered, "I'm ready." For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a victim in her own home. She felt like a woman with weapons, not of violence, but of truth, of preparation, of proof. The battle ahead might be long, but now she had a plan. She turned from the window, straightened her shoulders, and looked once more at Mark's photograph. "I won't let you down," she said softly. And with that, Linda felt the new version of herself rising, not the frightened widow they had underestimated, but the woman Mark had trusted to fight for her own life. Monday morning broke clear and cold over Chicago, sunlight bouncing off the crusted snow on Clark Street. Inside Linda's apartment, the scent of Earl Grey tea drifted through the warm air. She sat on the faded blue sofa that had held decades of family conversations. Her back straight, a porcelain cup cradled in both hands. The documents Mark had left her were stacked neatly on the coffee table like a silent army waiting to be deployed. At exactly 10 o'clock, a knock rattled the door. Through the peephole, she saw Michael and Emily flanking two men in black t-shirts carrying folded cardboard boxes. The movers' boots stamped snow onto her welcome mat as they stepped inside, glancing around awkwardly. "We're here to help pack," one said uncertainly. "Mom, we thought you'd be ready by now," Michael began, his voice clipped. "It's moving day." Linda placed her teacup gently on its saucer and stood. She wore a simple navy sweater, her silver hair pulled back neatly. "Sit down," she said quietly. "All of you," Emily opened her mouth to protest. "Linda, this isn't—" But Linda raised a hand, calm and steady. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a clear bell. The movers exchanged glances and retreated to the hallway. Michael blinked, confusion flashing across his face. "Mom, don't start this again. The truck's downstairs." Linda reached for the folder on the table and slid it toward him. "You might want to read before you speak." Emily frowned, leaning forward. "What is this?" Linda looked at them both, her eyes no longer pleading but sharp. "Proof," she said simply. "Proof that I own not just this apartment, but the Evanston property you're living in." The words landed like a stone in water. Michael's jaw dropped. The color drained from Emily's face. The room seemed to go silent except for the ticking clock. You can't be serious," Michael stammered. "Oh, I'm very serious," Linda replied. "I've given you 30 days to leave my property. Unless, of course, you want to offer me a sincere apology and start treating me with the respect I deserve." Emily's hands flew to her mouth. Tears welled up as she turned to Michael. "You told me she had nothing," she hissed. "You said we were helping her." Michael looked away, his face rigid, but his hands trembled. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. Linda sat back down, picking up her teacup with deliberate grace. "You're welcome to try and sue me," she said, a small smile playing at her lips. "Go ahead, see what happens." For the first time, Emily's composure cracked. She began to sob, accusing Michael of dragging her into a mess she didn't understand. He glared at her, but the fight had gone out of his shoulders. The two of them stood in the middle of Linda's living room, their power drained away, while the woman they had underestimated sat serene and immovable. Linda felt the tremor of adrenaline under her skin, but also a deep, steady calm. For months she had been shrinking in this space, apologizing for her existence. Now she sat taller, the morning light falling across her face, and she realized that this moment, this turning of the tide, was only the beginning. Late on a windy Thursday afternoon, the old apartment in Rogers Park seemed to hold its breath. The smell of chamomile tea lingered in the kitchen, and the faint hum of the radiator filled the silence. Linda sat at her dining table, a neat stack of legal documents laid out like playing cards before her. She had spent the morning carefully arranging each page, smoothing the creases, rehearsing what she needed to say. By the time the knock came, her heart was steady, though her hands still trembled slightly in her lap. The knock turned into pounding, 3, 4, 5 blows that rattled the door. Before she could rise, the door swung open and Michael strode in, his winter coat flapping. Snowflakes clung to his dark hair. He threw his coat onto a chair so hard it slipped to the floor. "What the hell are you doing, Mom?" he barked, his voice echoing off the walls. "You think you can scare me with your little games?" Linda stood slowly, palms flat on the table. "I'm not playing games, Michael," she said evenly. "And I'm not trying to scare you. I'm telling you the truth." Emily slipped in behind him, closing the door softly but with a tense hand. She kept her coat on, her eyes darting around the apartment. "You're manipulating us," she snapped. "This is all a setup to make us look bad." Linda tilted her head, a faint, sad smile crossing her lips. "Manipulating?" she repeated slowly, each syllable deliberate. "That's what you call it when a mother protects herself? That's how you see me now?" Michael's jaw tightened. "You made up this whole story about Dad's assets just to punish us." Linda inhaled deeply, reached for her leather handbag on the chair beside her, and drew out a thick folder. Without a word, she placed it on the table and flipped it open. Page after page of deeds, bank statements, and the original will slid out, the papers whispering against the wood. "Did I make up this will?" she asked, laying the document in front of him. "Did I fabricate these stock certificates? These property deeds?" Emily reached out with a trembling hand and lifted the top page. Her eyes scanned the familiar signature at the bottom. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice cracking. It's all real." "Don't listen to her," Michael barked, leaning over the table. "She's twisting this somehow." Emily turned to him, her face pale. "Enough, Michael," she said quietly but firmly. I'm tired of being lied to." Michael's mouth opened, but no words came out. For a moment, the only sound was the radiator's hiss and the shuffle of paper under Emily's fingers. Linda looked at her son, his flushed face, the way his fists clenched at his sides, and felt a pang of both grief and release. This was the boy she had raised, now a man she barely recognized. "I never wanted it to come to this," she said softly. "But you forced my hand. I spent my life giving, and you mistook it for weakness." She slid another document toward them, Mark's handwritten letter. "Your father trusted me to stand up for myself. That's what I'm doing now." Emily lowered herself into a chair, still holding the will. Her eyes brimmed with tears. "Michael, she's telling the truth," she said. "All this time." Michael stared at his wife, his voice rising again but losing its force. "She's manipulating you," he said, but it sounded more like a plea than an accusation. Emily shook her head. "No, you are." Linda remained standing, her hands resting lightly on the table, feeling both weary and unshakably strong. The room seemed to shift, the power dynamic tilting at last. For months she had been the one trembling, Now it was them. The papers in Emily's hands trembled as if they were alive. Her fingers, usually so steady when signing contracts for her real estate clients, now left damp fingerprints on the crisp legal documents. She stared at the signature on the will, Mark Walker's name, bold and unmistakable. Then at the rows of numbers on the bank statements. It was all true. Everything Linda had said was true. The radiator hissed softly. Outside, a gust of February wind rattled the window panes. Emily's mascara smudged as tears welled up and slid down her cheeks, darkening the collar of her cream-colored sweater. She lowered the papers onto the table as if they were something fragile. Mrs. Walker. Her voice cracked, and she started again, this time softer. Linda, I'm sorry. I believed Michael completely. I thought I was helping him protect you. Her shoulders shook once, a silent sob escaping. Across the table, Linda's face remained composed, but her eyes softened just a little. She folded her hands on the polished wood and spoke calmly. This isn't all your fault, Emily. I know how convincing he can be. Michael shifted, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. Emily, don't start, he snapped. She's twisting everything. No. Emily's voice cut through the room like a blade. She turned to him, her eyes glistening but fierce. You filled my head with so many things about your mother, that she was unstable, that she'd ruin our happiness, that she couldn't live alone. Her words came faster now, as if breaking free. I repeated them because I trusted you. But it was all lies, wasn't it? Michael raised a hand as if to stop her. Enough, Emily. Don't you ever tell me to be quiet again, she shouted, her voice echoing off the old plaster walls. The sound startled even herself. She pushed back from the table, standing tall, her palms flat on the wood. I'm done being silent. I'm done being used to hurt someone who's only ever tried to be kind to me. Linda watched quietly, a strange mixture of pride and sadness rising in her chest. This was the first time she had seen Emily stand for something on her own. Michael's expression hardened into something cold and calculated. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. Fine, he said with a sneer. If that's how it's going to be, choose. Choose her or me. You can't have both. For a heartbeat, Emily didn't move. She stared into his eyes. The man she had married, the father of her unborn child, and saw only manipulation staring back. The decision formed like a stone in her stomach. She straightened her back. If that's the choice, she said slowly, her voice steady now, then it's over. Michael's jaw dropped, the color draining from his face. You're not serious. You can't raise our child alone, he stammered, the first crack in his confidence showing. Emily inhaled deeply, then turned her head toward Linda. For the first time since she had met her mother-in-law, her gaze held something like warmth. I won't be alone, she said quietly but firmly. I have her. Linda blinked, feeling a lump rise in her throat. She didn't speak. She didn't trust herself to. But she met Emily's eyes and gave the smallest nod. In that small kitchen in Rogers Park, something shifted. The air felt different, like the moment after a storm when you realize the worst has passed. Michael sat frozen, looking between the two women, realizing perhaps for the first time that his control had slipped away. Emily wiped her tears with the back of her hand, straightened her shoulders, and exhaled. She had stepped across a line, and there was no going back. The kitchen felt strangely quiet after Emily's declaration. The old clock above the stove ticked, filling the silence with its steady pulse. Linda sat at the small wooden table she'd had since the 1980s, her hands folded in her lap, knuckles pale. She could still smell the faint aroma of the chicken she'd roasted earlier, now cold on the counter. Her eyes, however, were fixed on her son. Michael stood in the middle of the kitchen, shifting his weight from one foot to the other like a boy caught misbehaving. Emily sat at the edge of a chair, eyes red from crying. "Linda," she whispered, voice trembling. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes to make this right. I was wrong. I see it now." Linda gave a small nod but said nothing. She wasn't ready to open the floodgates of forgiveness. Decades of sacrifice, the sting of recent betrayal, the humiliation of being treated like a burden, it all still sat heavy on her chest. Michael's gaze darted between the two women. He seemed to sense the ground shifting beneath his feet, his usual confidence slipping. For a moment, his jaw tightened as if he would argue, but then his expression softened unnaturally. He stepped forward, his leather shoes squeaking against the worn linoleum, and suddenly, to everyone's surprise, dropped to his knees. "Mom," he began, the word thick on his tongue. "Mom, you're right. All of this. It's my fault. I've been selfish. Please, forgive me." He clasped his hands together like a penitent parishioner at church, but his eyes kept flicking toward the stack of documents on the table. Linda stared down at him. For a heartbeat, she saw not the man, but the little boy she had once carried home from soccer practice, muddy and laughing. But that image dissolved quickly. The man kneeling now was calculating, not contrite. She could see it in the tightness of his smile, in the way he tilted his head just so, like he had in every negotiation he ever tried to win. "You're asking for forgiveness now," she said slowly, her voice low but firm. "Only after you discovered I'm not the poor, helpless old woman you thought I was?" Michael blinked rapidly. "No, Mom, that's not it. I was angry, confused. Please, just give me another chance." Linda leaned forward, placing her palms flat on the table. "You threatened to have me declared legally incompetent," she reminded him, her voice trembling with controlled fury. "You called me a manipulative old woman. You tried to take the home your father built for us. Do you remember those things?" Michael's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. I wasn't thinking," he murmured. "No," Linda said, shaking her head. "You knew exactly what you were saying. You knew exactly what you were doing." Emily turned her head away, biting her lip. Watching her husband kneeling there, his expensive coat wrinkled at the knees, she felt a rush of shame. Tears slid silently down her face. This was not the man she had believed in, not the man she had defended. Michael's hands trembled as he reached out toward his mother. "Please, Mom," he whispered. "Please don't give up on me." Linda stayed still, her heart heavy but resolute. She had waited a long time for this moment, but not like this. Not through a performance. The kitchen clock ticked again. Somewhere outside, a bus roared past on Clark Street, carrying on with life as if nothing inside this small apartment was happening. Emily finally stood, wiping her cheeks. She looked at Michael, her husband, kneeling on the faded linoleum like a stranger, and then at Linda. "I don't even know who you are anymore," she said softly. Her voice broke on the last word. Michael stayed on his knees, staring at the floor, as the weight of his failed act hung heavy in the room. The apartment felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Outside the window, the February dusk of Chicago had settled in, casting long gray shadows across the small living room. The radiator hissed softly. Linda sat in her armchair, fingers tracing the edge of the armrest, her eyes steady on Emily. Across from her, Emily sat on the edge of the sofa, shoulders tense, one hand resting on the swell of her belly. Michael hovered near the doorway, arms crossed, his foot tapping impatiently on the hardwood floor. "Emily." Linda's voice was quiet, but carried an unmistakable firmness. "How do you plan to make this right?" Emily lifted her eyes, meeting Linda's gaze for a moment before they flicked to Michael. Her lips trembled, but her words came clear. "By leaving him," she said, almost in a whisper. But the weight of the words filled the room. Michael jerked upright, his face flushing red. "You're carrying my child and you dare say that?" he barked, stepping closer. His voice cracked with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Emily straightened her back, her hand instinctively pressing against her stomach. "Our child," she corrected, her tone sharpening. "And I don't want our baby growing up watching you manipulate his grandmother. Or me." For a second, silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Michael's jaw clenched. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," he spat, his fists curling. Emily's eyes glistened, but her voice did not waver. "The biggest mistake of my life was marrying you," she replied, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her maternity sweater. "I see that now, and I won't let our child grow up thinking this is normal." Linda watched the exchange, her heart heavy but also strangely relieved. She could see the steel forming in Emily's spine, the same steel that had once lived in her own when she was a young woman. She thought of Mark and the long road she had walked alone. Michael began pacing, running his hands through his hair. "You can't just take my kid and walk out," he growled. "I'll take you to court. I'll prove you're unstable. I'll prove your precious mother-in-law is crazy. You'll both regret this," Linda finally spoke, her voice calm but cutting like a knife. "And with what money will you do that, Michael?" she asked softly. "Tomorrow I'll be speaking with your boss about certain matters. Let's see how far you get then." Michael froze mid-step, his face draining of color. "You wouldn't dare," he hissed. Linda leaned back in her chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Of course I would," she said evenly. "You should know by now I don't make empty threats." For a moment, all three of them stayed frozen in the dim light of the living room. The old clock ticked on the wall, a slow, steady beat that seemed to mark the end of something. Michael's eyes darted from his wife to his mother, realizing, perhaps for the first time, that the power he had once wielded so easily had slipped away. He licked his lips, searching for words, but none came. Finally, with a sound somewhere between a growl and a sigh, he turned on his heel. "This isn't over," he muttered, yanking the door open so hard it rattled against the frame. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving only the faint echo of his footsteps fading down the hallway. Emily exhaled a shaky breath, her shoulders collapsing as if she'd been holding up a heavy weight for far too long. She looked at Linda, eyes wet but resolute. "I'm done, Linda," she said softly. "I'm not going back." Linda reached out, placing a hand over Emily's. "Good," she murmured, her voice both sad and proud. "Now, let's figure out how to build something better for you and the baby." The radiator hissed again. The old clock ticked on. And for the first time in years, the little apartment on Clark Street felt like a place of quiet. Strength instead of quiet despair. The door slammed shut with a violent crack that echoed through. The small Rogers Park apartment. The old wooden frame shuddered, picture frames rattling slightly on the hallway wall. For a moment, the only sound left was the ticking of the kitchen clock and the distant hum of the heater. Michael's footsteps faded down the stairwell, leaving behind a thick, almost tangible silence. Linda stayed seated in her armchair, staring at the closed door. Her hands, which had been clenched tightly on the armrests, slowly loosened. She felt her heartbeat thudding in her ears, not from fear, but from the strange calm after a storm. Across the room, Emily stood near the window, her coat still on, her hands wrapped protectively around her belly as if to shield it from the cold that had seeped in with Michael's anger. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The apartment, once filled with Mark's laughter and the smell of his Sunday coffee, felt like a chapel after a funeral, quiet, solemn, heavy with what had just passed. Finally, Emily's voice cracked the silence, so small and tremulous that it barely carried across the room. "Mrs. Walker, can you ever forgive me?" she whispered, her eyes fixed on the floor. Linda looked up slowly, her gaze landing on the young woman who only a few hours ago had helped push her toward the edge of despair. Emily looked nothing like the polished realtor who had strutted through open houses. Her makeup had smudged under tears, her cheeks were pale and her hands trembled as she held onto her stomach. She was just 28, barely older than Michael had been when he'd started his first business. And yet she looked exhausted, like someone twice her age. "I don't know," Linda said at last, her voice low but honest. "I truly don't." The words hung in the air, not cruel, but raw in their truth. Emily nodded, her lips quivering as she bit down on them. "I understand," she murmured. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." She moved slowly toward the coffee table, pulling from her bag a small velvet pouch, the pouch of jewelry Linda had thought was gone for good. She set it down gently in front of her mother-in-law, the sound of the clasp clicking open oddly loud in the still room. Inside, the old wedding ring, a gold brooch from Mark's mother, and a string of pearls glinted under the lamplight. "These belong to you," Emily said softly. "I'm so sorry for taking them. For everything." Linda's eyes flicked from the jewelry to the young woman clutching her belly. In that moment, she saw not just betrayal, but also fear and a desperate desire to make amends. Emily's shoulders sagged as she asked, almost like a child, "Could I stay here tonight? Just tonight. I have nowhere else to go." The clock ticked again. Linda reached out, her fingers brushing the velvet pouch, then looked back at Emily. "One night," she said slowly, her voice still firm but with a gentleness creeping in. "Tomorrow we'll talk about how you can earn back my trust." Emily let out a shaky breath, tears spilling down her cheeks as she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. Linda rose from her chair and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside. Outside, the streetlights cast a soft orange glow on the snow-covered street. She thought of Mark, of the years she had spent alone, and of the long road ahead. Yet somewhere deep inside her chest, where grief and anger had been coiled tight for so long, a small spark of hope flickered. Behind her, Emily sat down on the sofa, removing her coat and laying a hand over her stomach. The baby kicked, and she smiled faintly, as if the child itself had sensed the shift in the air. Linda exhaled slowly and turned back to the room. For the first time in months, the apartment didn't feel like a battleground. It felt like a fragile truce, and maybe, just maybe, the start of something new. The days that followed felt both foreign and fragile, like walking on thin ice. Linda's apartment in Rogers Park, usually so quiet, now carried the muted sounds of another person moving carefully through it. Emily had taken up the pull-out sofa in the living room, a room Linda had always kept immaculate, filled with Mark's old books and a faded Persian rug they'd bought decades ago at a neighborhood estate sale. Every morning, Linda would rise before sunrise out of long habit. She'd brew her coffee in the old French press, the aroma drifting through the apartment, and listen for signs of Emily stirring. Emily, for her part, moved softly, her slippers making only the faintest whisper against the hardwood floors. They exchanged polite words about breakfast or the weather, their voices tentative, like strangers forced to share a space. On the second morning, as snow melted in streaks along Clark Street, Linda noticed how Emily washed her own dishes immediately after eating. She wiped the counters without being asked, folded the blankets on the sofa, and even took out the recycling. It was small, but Linda registered each act, her eyes following from the kitchen doorway. Is she really changing, she wondered, or just acting for now? Emily, meanwhile, seemed to sense the scrutiny. She would catch Linda's gaze and offer a small, uncertain smile before returning to whatever chore she had set herself to. The apartment felt like a stage on which both women were testing new roles, one trying to atone, the other trying to decide whether to believe. By the third day, the winter sun had finally broken through, casting pale golden light across the balcony where Linda tended her plants. She still watered them every morning, even in January, a ritual she had kept since Mark's death. Today she was gently misting the leaves of a stubborn fern when she heard the soft pad of footsteps behind her. "Mrs. Walker," Emily said quietly. Linda didn't turn, only gave a slight nod, her eyes still on the plants. Emily stepped closer, holding out a delicate china cup filled with tea. The steam curled upward, carrying the scent of chamomile and honey. "I made this for you," she offered. Linda took the cup but remained silent, watching a gull wheel over Lake Michigan's gray surface. She felt Emily lower herself into the wicker chair opposite, the chair Michael used to sink into, phone in hand like a king in his throne. "I've been thinking a lot," Emily began, her voice lower, stripped of its old sharpness, "about everything. About how we got here. Her hands rested over her belly, fingers splayed as if grounding herself. Linda didn't respond. She simply sipped the tea, its warmth seeping into her palms, and let the silence stretch. Sometimes silence, she had learned, spoke louder than words. Emily stared at the floorboards, then at the lake beyond the railing. I don't know if I can undo what I've done, she admitted, but I want you to know I'm not here out of convenience. I'm here because I don't want to be the woman I was. Linda's gaze flicked to her at last, searching her face for sincerity. The wind off the lake blew a strand of hair across Emily's cheek. She didn't brush it away. I don't expect forgiveness overnight, Emily continued. I just want the chance to prove I can be different. For the baby and for myself. Linda set the cup down on the balcony railing and folded her arms. She still didn't speak, but something in her posture softened just slightly. Emily noticed it and gave a small, almost hopeful smile. The gull cried again overhead. The lake shimmered under the winter sun. In that quiet moment, neither woman knew what the future held, but both sensed that something fragile and real was beginning to shift. Not forgiveness yet, but perhaps the first small step toward it. That evening, the apartment was cloaked in the muted amber light of the setting sun. The glow from Lake Michigan filtered through the balcony doors, casting long stripes across the living room rug. Linda sat in her armchair, a half-knitted scarf in her lap, her fingers still as she watched Emily pacing near the window. The young woman's arms were crossed, her head slightly bowed, her breath uneven as if she were rehearsing words she had never said aloud before. Finally, Emily stopped and exhaled, a trembling sigh that seemed to pull something out of her. It wasn't just Michael who changed me, she said, her voice husky and low. I let him change me. Linda's knitting needles clinked softly against each other as she set them aside. She turned her head and really looked at Emily. Under the soft light, the girl's face looked thinner than before, her once perfectly styled hair now hanging loosely. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, giving her the appearance of someone much older than 28. Why? Linda asked quietly, her voice calm but laced with something deeper. Hurt, perhaps, or a long-held question finally surfacing. Emily's hands fell to her sides. Because, she hesitated, twisting the hem of her sweater. Because it was easier to blame you than to admit I'd married the wrong man. The words landed heavy in the air between them. Linda felt her chest tighten as though someone had placed a stone there. Easier to blame me? She echoed, her tone a mixture of disbelief and sadness. Emily nodded and sank onto the edge of the sofa, her eyes staring at some invisible point on the floor. He isolated me, she began, her voice steadier now, like a dam cracking. First it was small things. He didn't want me meeting my old coworkers after hours. Then he told me to quit my job at the accounting firm. Said he'd take care of everything so I could focus on the home. Her lips twisted bitterly. He controlled every dollar. Even my phone. He said you were manipulative, that you were trying to ruin our marriage. Linda pressed a hand to her mouth, the memories of cold dinners and clipped phone calls flooding back. And you believed him? She asked softly. I wanted to believe him, Emily admitted. He kept saying you'd never understand, that you'd tell me to leave him, and that would destroy our family. He painted you as this obstacle, so I stayed quiet. I stayed loyal, and I let him convince me you were the enemy. Her voice cracked on the last word. She clasped her hands together, nails digging into her skin, as if trying to hold herself together. I didn't just let him control me, Mrs. Walker. I handed him the keys. Linda leaned back, her eyes fixed on Emily's trembling form. Each revelation felt like a blade sliding under old scars. She remembered every cold glance, every icy word Emily had thrown at her under Michael's direction, and now it all made sense. The betrayal was real, but so was the suffering. You never once thought to tell me? Linda asked, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper. Emily lifted her head, eyes wet. He told me you wouldn't care, that you'd tell me to tough it out, or worse, you'd use it against me. I was so scared of losing everything, my marriage, my home, my sense of being good enough, that I stayed silent. Linda swallowed hard. She saw not a villain, but a young woman who had been trapped and shaped by fear. "You've been living in a cage," she murmured. Emily gave a small, hollow laugh. "Yes, and I didn't even see the bars until now." For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of traffic and the ticking of the kitchen clock. Linda rose slowly, walked over, and placed a tentative hand on Emily's shoulder. "You're out of that cage now," she said softly. "And you're telling me the truth. That matters." Emily looked up at her, tears streaming freely now. "I don't know how to be different yet," she whispered. "But I want to learn." Linda squeezed her shoulder gently. "Then we start from here," she said, her own throat tight. And in that small, sunlit living room, two women, once adversaries, now something else entirely, sat facing each other with the weight of the past between them, but also, for the first time, the faint outline of a future they might rebuild. 2 weeks had passed since Michael stormed out of the apartment, leaving a trail of anger and slammed doors behind him. The winter snow outside had started to melt, leaving slushy patches along the sidewalks of Rogers Park. Inside, the apartment had slowly begun to feel less like a battlefield and more like a fragile refuge. Linda was in the kitchen wiping down the counters when she heard Emily's phone buzz on the coffee table. Emily glanced at the screen and froze. The color drained from her face. "It's the building manager," she murmured. She put the call on speaker, and a nervous male voice filled the room. "Mrs. Walker? Your husband's downstairs in the lobby. He's demanding to be let up, says he wants to see his wife." Emily's hands trembled. "I told him not to come here," she said to the manager, her voice shaking. "Please don't let him up." "He's refusing to leave," the manager replied. "He's shouting at the front desk and threatening to call the police." Emily's eyes darted to Linda, panic rising. "What do we do?" she whispered. Linda dried her hands calmly on a dish towel, her movements deliberate. "Call the manager back," she said evenly. "Tell him I'm on my way down." Emily stared at her. "Abba! He's angry. I don't know what he'll do." "That's exactly why I have to go down," Linda answered, slipping on her gray wool coat. Her voice was steady, almost serene, but inside she could feel her heart pounding. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind many times. Now it was here. The elevator ride felt endless, the cables groaning softly as it descended. When the doors opened into the lobby, the noise hit her like a gust of cold wind. Michael's voice echoed off the marble walls, loud, harsh, slurred. "I know she's up there." He was yelling at the manager, his finger jabbing the air. "That old witch is hiding my wife!" "You're all complicit." Linda walked across the polished floor, her heels clicking sharply, a sound that seemed to slice through his shouting. "Good afternoon, Michael," she said, her tone calm but unmistakably firm. He spun around. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair unkempt, and the sour smell of alcohol clung to him. "You," he spat. "Give me back my wife." Linda stopped a few feet away, keeping her posture straight. "Emily is exactly where she wants to be," she replied. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried. Michael took a step forward, fists clenching and unclenching. "You think you've won? You think you can turn her against me? You've done that yourself," Linda said softly. "Now I need you to leave this building. You can't tell me what to do." He barked. "I'm her husband." Linda reached into her coat pocket and held up her phone. "If you don't leave right now, I'll call the police. And this time, Michael, they will come for you." For a moment, he just stared at her, his chest heaving, the lobby falling silent except for the soft hum of the front desk computer. The manager, standing behind the counter, watched with wide eyes, ready to intervene. Michael's face twitched, a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You're bluffing," he muttered, but the edge in his voice had dulled. Linda took one slow step closer. "No, I'm finished bluffing. Go home." He hesitated, the bravado draining from him like water from a cracked cup. Finally, he turned sharply on his heel, muttering curses under his breath, and pushed through the glass doors into the cold afternoon. Linda stood very still, her heart hammering, but her face composed. The manager exhaled loudly. "Mrs. Walker, that was necessary," Linda finished for him, slipping her phone back into her pocket. "It was necessary," As she walked back to the elevator, the adrenaline slowly faded, leaving behind a trembling relief. For the first time, she felt the full weight of her own strength. Not Mark's. Not the lawyer's, not even Emily's. Hers. She pressed the button to return upstairs, and when the doors closed, she allowed herself a small, quiet smile. Upstairs, Emily was waiting, pale and tense. When Linda stepped out, Emily rushed forward. "What happened?" "He's gone," Linda said simply, taking off her coat. She met Emily's wide eyes and added, "And he won't be back. Not like that. Not anymore." And for the first time in months, Linda believed it. The lobby of the building hummed with a tense silence. Outside, a sleet-like rain tapped against the tall glass windows, streaking down like silver threads. Michael stood in the center of the polished marble floor, his fists clenched, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. "This isn't your building," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Linda. "You're lying! You've lied about everything." His face was flushed, his tie crooked, and a bead of sweat rolled down his temple despite the winter chill. Linda stood a few steps away, her coat draped neatly over her shoulders, one hand holding her phone. Her expression was calm, but her heart thudded hard beneath her sweater. She knew this was the moment she had been preparing for. "Michael," she said softly but firmly, "I don't need to argue with you. I'll let someone else do the talking." She tapped her phone screen and held it up. "Victoria, can you hear me?" she said into the speaker. On the other end came the crisp, composed voice of Victoria Bennett, her attorney. "I can, Linda. What do you need?" Linda pressed the speaker button so everyone in the lobby could hear. "Would you please confirm for the record who owns 1247 Clark Street Apartments?" she asked. Her voice didn't waver. "Of course," Victoria replied, her words as sharp and clear as glass. "You, Mrs. Linda Walker, are the sole and exclusive owner of that building. You hold the deed free and clear." The words hung in the air. Even the receptionist at the front desk stopped typing. Michael's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The building manager, who had been standing awkwardly by the elevators, glanced at Michael with dawning realization, his eyebrows lifting as if to say, "So it's true." Linda lowered the phone slowly, still looking directly at her son. "Do you need me to have Victoria email you a copy?" she asked, her tone almost gentle. "Or perhaps you'd prefer I call the police right now?" Michael swallowed hard. "This isn't over," he muttered, but the force in his voice was gone. His shoulders sagged as if the air had been punched out of him. "You can't ruin me." Linda took a small step closer. "I'm not ruining you," she said quietly. "You're doing that yourself. Tomorrow I'll be speaking with your supervisor at Westfield Tech. The day after that, with the bank that financed your car and your condo. You've left a paper trail, Michael. I've simply chosen to follow it." His eyes flickered. Fear, disbelief, anger. Then he spun on his heel and pushed through the glass doors into the wet street, his figure swallowed by the misty drizzle. The manager let out a long, low breath. "Mrs. Walker?" he said softly. "I think he finally got the message." Linda slipped her phone back into her purse and adjusted her coat. "Not yet," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "But he will." She walked back to the elevator, her heels making measured clicks on the marble. Her hands were steady now, but inside she felt the tremor of adrenaline. She had stood her ground, calmly, firmly, and the truth had spoken louder than any threat. Upstairs, Emily waited by the door, worry etched across her face. "Is he gone?" she asked. "For now," Linda answered, hanging up her coat. She forced a small smile for Emily's sake. But men like Michael don't disappear quietly. "We'll be ready." And indeed, 2 months later, the storm arrived. A thick envelope from Cook County Circuit Court landed in Linda's mailbox, its seal stark against the white paper. Michael had filed for custody of Emily's unborn child, accusing both women of manipulation and emotional abuse. Linda sat at the kitchen table, the papers spread out before her, the weight of them heavy but no longer terrifying. She knew now that she had weapons of her own, not lies, but facts, proof, and a lawyer who wouldn't back down. She looked at Emily, who was holding her belly protectively, and reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "He's going to try everything," Linda said softly. "But we're not the ones in the dark anymore. The truth is on our side." Emily nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "We'll fight," she whispered. And for the first time, Linda felt not just resolve but a quiet, powerful certainty. The truth, once brought into the light, was stronger than Michael's threats could ever be. The morning of the hearing dawned gray and damp, the kind of Chicago winter day where the air smells faintly of metal and snow. Linda rose at 5, as she had done her entire life, and brewed a small pot of coffee in her old French press. She chose her outfit carefully, a navy wool coat over a simple dress, and clasped around her neck the delicate silver necklace Mark had given her on their 25th anniversary. It was more than jewelry. It was a talisman, a reminder of a steadiness she still carried inside her. Across the apartment, Emily was getting dressed slowly. Her belly, 5 months along now, curved gently beneath a fitted teal dress. She sat on the edge of the bed, one hand on her stomach, breathing through a wave of nerves. "Do I look too obvious?" she asked quietly. Linda walked over and adjusted a loose strand of hair behind Emily's ear. "You look like a woman who's about to tell the truth," she said softly. "That's never too obvious." By 9 o'clock, they were at the Cook County Courthouse, a tall, echoing building where the marble floors carried the sound of every footstep. In courtroom 305, the smell of paper and old wood hung heavy in the air. Michael sat at the plaintiff's table, a dark suit straining at his shoulders, his hair slicked back. Beside him was a lawyer in a sharp gray suit, one of those men whose confidence seems to fill the room before he even speaks. As the proceedings began, Michael's attorney rose and launched into his narrative. He painted Linda as a toxic mother-in-law who had manipulated her son's wife, turned her against him, and orchestrated a campaign to alienate him from his future child. The words unstable and controlling echoed across the courtroom like stones being thrown. Linda sat upright, her hands folded calmly in her lap, but she felt Emily's fingers tighten around her arm under the table. She gave a small squeeze back, a silent reassurance. Then it was Victoria Bennett's turn. The attorney's calm presence was like cool water on fire. She rose, her papers organized into neat stacks, and began to speak in a steady, clear voice. "Your Honor," she said, "we have evidence that tells a different story." One by one, she introduced the text messages Michael had sent to Emily. Cruel, demeaning words projected onto the courtroom's screen. She played audio recordings where Michael's voice, harsh and unmistakable, threatened and belittled both women. She read statements from neighbors at Rogers Park who had witnessed his late-night rages and public outbursts. The tide in the room shifted. Michael's confident posture sagged. His attorney's objections grew more frantic. In the back row, a reporter scribbled furiously into a notebook, and then came the moment Linda would never forget. Judge Robert Hill, a man with salt and pepper hair and a measured tone, adjusted his glasses and looked down at her. His eyes softened. "Mrs. Walker," he said slowly, "I believe we've met before. Years ago, when I was a law student volunteering at the youth center, you funded our music program, didn't you?" Linda blinked in surprise but nodded. "Yes, Your Honor," she said quietly. He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile before his expression returned to the solemnity of the bench. "The court has heard enough," he announced. "It is clear who has been manipulative in this case, and it is not Mrs. Walker." His ruling came down like the clear toll of a bell. Michael's petition for custody was denied. He was stripped of visitation rights until further review and ordered to stay away from both women. He would pay child support and damages for his harassment. The gavel struck wood. Case closed. Emily let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. Outside the courtroom, under the gray sky, she turned and hugged Linda tightly, burying her face into her shoulder like she had when she was a child. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not giving up on me." 6 months later, the apartment on Clark Street smelled of something new: baby powder and warm milk. Little Sophie had arrived, her soft cries echoing down the hallway. On a cool spring morning, Linda sat on the small balcony overlooking Lake Michigan, gently rocking her granddaughter in her arms. The lake sparkled under the rising sun, gulls wheeling overhead. Emily stepped out with 2 mugs of tea, her hair loose, her face softer now. She watched Linda sway the baby gently and asked, her voice low, "Have you really forgiven me?" Linda looked down at the sleeping infant, then up at Emily. "I have," she said. "And more importantly, you've started to forgive yourself. That's how we move forward." Emily's eyes filled, but this time it wasn't with guilt. It was with hope. Linda reached for her hand, and for a moment, with the lake shining behind them, and the baby's breath warm against her chest, it felt as though the long winter of their lives had finally broken into spring. The months that followed were filled with quiet mornings and soft laughter. On that same balcony where Linda had once sat alone with her fears, she now sat with Emily and baby Sophie, 3 generations sharing the same sunlight. The apartment no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a home again. Emily had found a part-time job at a small accounting firm and was slowly rebuilding her independence. She and Linda cooked together in the evenings, filling the kitchen with the smell of fresh bread and tomato soup, while Sophie babbled from her high chair, kicking her tiny feet to an invisible rhythm. One afternoon, Linda placed her hand gently over Emily's and said, "You're stronger than you know, and you're never alone." Emily smiled through tears, whispering, "I learned that from you." It was in those quiet exchanges, a hand held, a meal shared, a story retold, that the wounds began to heal. The woman who had once been cornered and underestimated had found not only justice, but a new kind of family built on truth and courage. Looking back at the long, painful journey, the betrayal, the courtroom battles, the sleepless nights, Linda realized it had all led to this moment of rebirth. She had lost illusions but gained clarity. She had been pushed out of her own home but had reclaimed her dignity. She had watched a young woman stumble and then rise, and she had become once again the guardian of her own story. This story is a reminder that silence is not safety, that dignity is worth fighting for, and that even in the darkest times, compassion can rebuild what was broken. If you felt moved by Linda's journey, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need hope today, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapters of resilience and redemption. Leave a comment below, even just a simple, "I'm listening," to let us know you're here, and to help keep this circle of stories alive. We'll see you in the next video.